The sun over Esperanza Wells had no mercy. It hung in the sky like a white-hot coin, bleaching the life from everything it touched. Dust, thick and lazy, coated the single street. Jed guided his horse down from the ridge, feeling the heat press in. He was only in town for salt and nails, simple things. But the town was never simple for him, not with Apache blood in his veins. The whispers always followed him, ghosts from a war he never fought. He learned to tune them out, to build a wall of silence around himself. But today the silence was broken. A low hum of anticipation pulled him toward the town plaza. A wooden platform stood near the courthouse, raw and ugly under the sun. A crowd had gathered, their faces pinched with a mix of heat and cruel curiosity. Something was happening, and then he saw her. A young woman stood on the platform. Her hands were bound with rough cord. A faded calico dress, torn at the sleeve, clung to her frame. Her hair, a wild tumble of chestnut, was loose in the desert wind. She was young, maybe 24, but hardship had already sketched its lines around her mouth. She held her chin high, a small act of defiance in a world set against her. But Jed saw the exhaustion in her stance, the deep weariness of a soul that had fought too long. Sheriff Hollis, a man built like a barrel, stepped forward. "This here's Flora Whitfield," he boomed. "Caught her behind Holcom's store with a loaf of bread and a knife that ain't hers." The crowd murmured, leaning in. "Town councils agreed," Hollis continued. "She'll serve 60 days of labor to repay her debt. Anyone in need of help, step up and make your bid." In auction, not for a horse or a side of beef, for a human being. Jed felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It was shame, dressed up in the law's fancy words. Men started calling out offers, their voices slick with contempt. "I'll take her for kitchen work," one slurred with a nasty smirk. Another laughed. "My wife needs help with the laundry." The crowd chuckled, hungry for the spectacle. Through it all, the woman, Flora, stood straight. Jed could see the tremor in her bound hands, but her eyes were ice. They swept across the faces, cold and measuring, refusing to break. For a single fleeting heartbeat, her gaze met Jed's, and he felt it like a lightning strike. Not fear, not anger. Something else entirely. Recognition. He fought the urge to stay back, the instinct that had kept him safe for so long. He had sworn off other people's troubles, but his feet were already moving, carrying him through the ring of gawking townsfolk until he stood at the foot of the platform. $10, a rancher shouted. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Jed's voice cut through it, low and steady. "Enough!" Every head turned. Silence fell, thick and heavy as the desert heat. Jed stepped closer, his eyes locked on the sheriff. "What's the fine?" Sheriff Hollis blinked, thrown off. "The fine?" "The cost," Jed said, his voice flat. "The bread, the knife, the court's fee. Say it plain." Hollis cleared his throat, sweating under his collar. "2 for the bread, 5 for the knife, another 3 for processing. $10 all told." Jed reached into his coat, pulling out a worn leather pouch. He slowly, deliberately counted out the coins. The clink of metal was the only sound in the plaza. He placed the sum in the sheriff's fat palm. "Paid!" The crowd erupted. "You can't just do that!" One man yelled. "She owes time!" Another shouted. Jed's gaze swept over them, quiet but unyielding as a mountain. "The debt is cleared. The law has its coin." He turned back to Hollis. "She walks free." The sheriff hesitated, his dislike for Jed warring with the weight of the silver in his hand. The quiet calm in the Apache's eyes was more unsettling than any threat. Finally, he barked at his deputy. "Cut her loose!" The rope fell away from Flora's wrists. She rubbed them, her eyes never leaving Jed. But just as she took a step off the platform, another man stepped forward. Caldwell, the freight baron, a man whose shadow touched every business in Esperanza Wells. His smile was thin and sharp as barbed wire. "Not so fast, Hollis," Caldwell drawled, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. "The girl's debt wasn't just to the town. I bought her debt from Holcomb at the store this morning. The bread, the knife. She owes me now." A gasp went through the crowd. This was better than a simple labor auction. This was a fight. Caldwell's eyes, small and hard, fixed on Jed. The $10 covers the town's inconvenience. But her time? Her labor? That belongs to me. He held up the paper, a signed note of debt. It was legal, it was binding, and it was a cage snapping shut. Flora froze, the flicker of hope in her eyes dying instantly. She was no longer town property. She was Caldwell's property. The freight baron smirked at Jed. Well, ain't that noble, he mocked. But what's a man like you want with a stray like her anyway? Jed didn't flinch. Nothing that concerns you. But now it did concern Caldwell. It concerned him very much. Flora's voice, though low, cut through the tension. I'm not yours. Caldwell's smile vanished. You are whatever I say you are. Now get over here. He gestured for his men, two rough-looking thugs who had been lounging by the saloon. They started forward. Jed didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Flora. The knife, he said, so quietly only she and the sheriff could hear. What kind of knife was it? Flora looked confused, her gaze darting from Jed to Caldwell's approaching men. I don't know. An old hunting knife. Horn handle. With a small bird carved into the base. Jed's entire body went still. Every muscle tensed. The wall of silence he'd built around himself for years didn't just crack. It shattered. He looked at Caldwell, and for the first time there was something other than quiet patience in his eyes. There was fire. That knife, Jed said, his voice now carrying across the plaza, was stolen, but not by her. The air crackled. Caldwell's men stopped in their tracks. The freight baron's face darkened. What are you talking about, Apache? She was caught with it. She was caught with it, Jed agreed, his eyes boring into Caldwell. But it belonged to my father. It was stolen from our camp the night raiders came through, the night they killed him. A wave of shock rolled through the crowd. This wasn't about a loaf of bread anymore. This was about murder. Sheriff Hollis looked from Jed to Caldwell, his face a mask of confusion and sweat. Is this true? Caldwell laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He's lying, trying to save the girl. It's just an old knife. But Flora was staring at Jed, a new light dawning in her eyes. It wasn't just recognition anymore. It was a shared history she hadn't even known existed. Suddenly she understood the look he'd given her. He hadn't seen a thief. He'd seen a ghost. Jed ignored Caldwell, his focus entirely on Flora. There was another man with you, wasn't there? When you were caught? Flora nodded slowly, her mind racing back. Yes, one of Caldwell's men. He said he saw me take it. He's the one who called the deputy. He planted it on you, Jed stated, not as a question, but as a fact. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture far darker than anyone in the plaza had imagined. This wasn't a random crime, it was a setup. The knife wasn't just a stolen item, it was a trophy, a piece of evidence Caldwell's man had foolishly kept and then used to frame a desperate woman. Caldwell had seen an opportunity to get cheap labor and get rid of a piece of his own bloody past at the same time. But he had made one fatal mistake. He hadn't counted on Jed being in town. He hadn't counted on him recognizing that knife. Caldwell's face was a thundercloud. This is nonsense, Sheriff. Arrest this man for interfering. But Hollis was frozen. The whole town knew the story of Jed's family, of the brutal raid years ago that had left him an orphan. To see the knife now, in this context, it changed everything. Jed took a slow step toward Flora. I'm taking her with me, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. This isn't over. Caldwell's men moved to block him, but Jed was faster. In a blur of motion, he grabbed the reins of his horse, vaulted into the saddle, and reached down, pulling Flora up behind him with surprising strength. The gelding reared, scattering the shocked crowd. Stop them, Caldwell roared. But it was too late. Jed spurred the horse, and they shot out of the plaza, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in their wake. As they cleared the town, Flora clung to him, her heart hammering against his back. You shouldn't have done that, she gasped, the wind whipping her words away. They'll hunt you. They'll kill you for this. Jed didn't look back. His jaw was set like stone. They already tried once. They rode hard, the sun beating down, the town of Esperanza Wells shrinking behind them. Flora risked a glance over her shoulder. She could see figures on horseback, small and dark against the dust. Caldwell's men. They were coming. Jed had not bought her freedom. He had just declared war. The road west was a ribbon of pale dust, shimmering in the heat. Jed pushed his horse, the gelding's powerful muscles straining. Behind them, the pursuit was relentless. Flora could feel the vibration of hooves through the horse's back, a steady, menacing drumbeat. The silence between them wasn't peaceful. It was stretched tight with unspoken questions and the imminent threat of violence. Jed finally spoke, his voice rough against the wind. "The mare. I had a spare tied at the rail. We'll have to split up." He was thinking ahead, already strategizing, but there was no time. The riders were gaining. He veered sharply off the trail, guiding the horse into a landscape of jagged red rock and thorny mesquite. "Hold on," he grunted. The gelding scrambled over loose rock, finding footing where there seemed to be none. The pursuit was forced to slow, but they were still coming. Flora looked at the man she was clinging to, a man she'd met less than an hour ago. He had paid her fine, accused the most powerful man in town of murder, and was now fleeing with her into the desert. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Jed's eyes were fixed on the treacherous path ahead. "The knife. It wasn't just my father's. It has a twin. My mother carved them both. I carry the other one." He didn't have to show her. The weight of his words was enough. This wasn't just about justice for his father. It was about a connection deeper than blood. The raiders who had orphaned him were somehow tied to her. And the knife was the key. He finally found what he was looking for. A narrow crevice, a crack in the rock face barely wide enough for them to slip through. He dismounted, pulling Flora down with him. "Stay here, and stay quiet." He led the horse away, deeper into the maze of rocks, hoping to draw the pursuit past their hiding spot. Flora pressed herself against the cold stone, her breath held tight in her chest. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, closer. She could hear the men cursing as they navigated the rough terrain. They were almost on top of her. One of the riders stopped, his horse just feet from her hiding place. "He can't have gone far. Spread out. Caldwell wants the girl back, and the Apache dead." Flora's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about a dead anymore. This was about silencing witnesses. She risked a peek through the crack. She saw two of them, their faces hard and cruel under the sun. They were bounty hunters, not just ranch hands, men who killed for coin. The ground trembled as Jed's horse, now riderless, bolted from its cover, spooked by a snake or by Jed himself. It was a perfect distraction. The men shouted, wheeling their horses to give chase. "There! He's on foot!" They galloped off, swallowed by the canyons. For a moment there was silence. Flora let out a shaky breath, thinking they were safe. But then a shadow fell over her. A third man stood at the entrance to the crevice. He hadn't followed the others. He'd been smarter. His smile was a yellow slash in his dusty face. "Well, look what I found." He lunged for her. Flora screamed, scrambling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The rock was hard at her back. His rough hands grabbed her arm, yanking her out into the glaring sun. He was strong, and she was weak with hunger and fear. He was dragging her back toward his horse when a sound split the air. Not a gunshot. A low, sharp whistle. The bounty hunter froze, his eyes scanning the rocks. The whistle came again, from a different direction this time. An echo. Jed was out there, playing games with them. The man's grip tightened on Flora's arm. "Your friend is clever, but not clever enough." He pulled a knife from his belt. But it wasn't just any knife. It was the twin to the one from the town square. Horn handle, a bird carved into the base. It was Jed's knife. The man must have taken it from him somehow. This changed everything. Jed wasn't just hiding. He was disarmed. Maybe he was hurt. Flora's fear morphed into a white-hot rage. She wasn't the helpless girl from the platform anymore. She twisted in the man's grasp, bringing her knee up hard into his groin. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She broke free, grabbing a heavy rock from the ground. He came at her, roaring with fury, but she swung the rock with all her might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered back, stunned, blood trickling from his temple. But he wasn't down. He shook his head, his eyes promising murder. And that's when Jed appeared. He dropped from a ledge above them, landing silently as a cat. He had no weapon, only his hands. The bounty hunter, seeing him, grinned. "So the ghost shows himself. I took this from you when you were down. A pretty little thing." He brandished Jed's knife. Jed didn't answer. He just moved. The two men circled each other, a deadly dance under the desert sun. The bounty hunter was bigger, armed. Jed was faster, fueled by a lifetime of silent fury. He feinted left, then ducked under a wild slash of the knife, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection. They crashed to the ground, rolling in the dust and gravel. The knife skittered away. Flora saw her chance. She scrambled for the fallen weapon, her fingers closing around the familiar horn handle. The bounty hunter shoved Jed off, climbing to his feet. He saw Flora with the knife and lunged, but Jed was there, tackling him from behind, wrapping his arm around the man's throat. The man thrashed, his boots kicking up dust, but Jed's grip was like iron. "Flora!" Jed grunted, his voice strained. "The rope! From his saddle!" Flora didn't hesitate. She ran to the man's horse, fumbling with the ties, her hands shaking. She pulled the lariat free and ran back. Together they tied the bounty hunter, binding his hands and feet until he was helpless. Jed stood over him, breathing heavily, his face grim. He took the knife from Flora, his knife, and slid it back into its sheath. It was like a part of him had been returned. The other two riders were still out there, chasing a ghost horse. They had to move and move fast. As they prepared to leave, Jed searched the bound man, pulling a worn leather pouch from his pocket. It wasn't coin, it was a folded, yellowed piece of paper, a map, a crude drawing of the Tularosa Basin. Several locations were circled in charcoal. One of them was a familiar shape, a low-slung ranch house against a mesa. Jed's ranch, Thunder Mesa, and next to it, a crudely drawn skull. They weren't just hunting him. They knew where he lived. They had a kill order. Suddenly, the isolated ranch wasn't a refuge. It was a trap. "We can't go there," Flora whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's the first place they'll look." Jed stared at the map, his face a mask. "It's the only place we can go," he said, his voice grim. "It's where this started. It's where it has to end." He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that he wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was riding straight into it, and he was taking her with him. They took the bounty hunter's horse and supplies, leaving the man tied and gagged in the shade. He wouldn't die from the heat, but he wouldn't be going anywhere soon. They rode hard, not toward the setting sun, but deeper into the mountains, toward the one place on earth that was supposed to be Jed's sanctuary, the one place that was now marked for death. The faint outline of Thunder Mesa appeared as the sky turned the color of cooling embers. It was a humble place, a low stone house built into the slope, a weathered corral, a well. It didn't look like a fortress, it looked like a home, and that made it all the more terrifying. It was something to lose. Flora slid from the saddle, every muscle screaming in protest. She looked at the small house, smoke curling from its chimney. "Someone's here," she said, her voice tight with alarm. Had Caldwell's men gotten here first? Were they walking into an ambush? Jed dismounted, his movements fluid and cautious. He held a hand up for silence, his eyes scanning every shadow, every rock. The smell of mesquite smoke was faint on the air, a familiar, comforting scent that now felt like a warning. "Stay here," he whispered to Flora, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. He moved toward the house, silent as the dust gathering around them. Flora's heart hammered against her ribs. She crouched behind a boulder, clutching a heavy piece of firewood she'd pulled from a stack. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind sounded like an approaching enemy. The door of the small house creaked open. Flora tensed, ready to fight. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the warm light from within. It wasn't one of Caldwell's thugs. It was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, a dark shawl pulled around her shoulders. She looked out into the twilight, her gaze sharp and knowing. "You can come out now, Jedediah," she called, her voice surprisingly strong. "The coffee is hot, and your guest looks like she could use a meal." Jed lowered his rifle, a flicker of relief crossing his face. He stepped out of the shadows. Donna Rosa, he said, his voice softer than Flora had ever heard it. I didn't expect you. The old woman smiled, a gesture that seemed to crinkle her entire face. The world is full of surprises. Now get inside before the night chill settles in your bones. Both of you. Flora followed Jed into the house, feeling the warmth of the hearth wash over her. The room was simple, clean, and filled with the scent of cedar and dried chilies. It felt safe. Donna Rosa handed Flora a steaming mug of coffee. Her dark eyes were kind but missed nothing. You have brought trouble with you, Nina, she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Flora nodded, unable to speak. Caldwell, Jed said, summing it up in one word. Donna Rosa nodded slowly. That man's shadow grows longer every year. He owns the town, the sheriff, everything. He thinks he owns the land itself. She looked from Jed to Flora. But he does not own the people, not all of them. She stirred the pot of beans bubbling over the fire. You found the knife, then? It wasn't a question. Flora and Jed exchanged a look. How could she possibly know? Donna Rosa saw their confusion and chuckled. I am old, not blind. I saw you in the plaza. I saw the look on your face, Jedediah, when the girl described the carving. I knew. She turned from the fire, her expression suddenly serious. Your father gave me a message years ago. He said if anything ever happened to him, if the two knives were ever brought together again, it meant the danger had returned. He told me to give the bearer of that message this. She walked over to a small carved wooden chest in the corner of the room. She opened it and took out a heavy iron key. It was old, ornate. He said this key opens a box he buried, a box containing proof. Proof of what Caldwell and his men did. Not just to your family, Jedediah, but to others. Land deeds, signed confessions, everything. Flora stared at the key, then at Jed. This was it, the weapon they needed. Not a rifle, but the truth. But there was a problem. Where is the box? Jed asked, his voice low. Donna Rosa's face fell. That is the part he did not tell me. He said only the one who carried the second knife would know where to look. He said it was a place of memory, a place you would know. Jed was silent for a long moment, his mind racing through the past, through the fog of grief and anger. A place of memory. Where? The weight of it all seemed to press down on him. The key was in his hand, but the lock was lost somewhere in the landscape of his childhood. Suddenly, a sound from outside shattered the quiet. The panicked whinny of a horse, then another. Jed and Flora ran to the window. In the moonlight, they could see them. Riders, at least 4 of them, spreading out to surround the small house. They hadn't followed them from town. They had been waiting. The map wasn't a plan to hunt them down. It was a plan for an execution. The ranch wasn't a trap they were walking into. It was a tomb. Get away from the windows, Jed ordered, his voice sharp. He grabbed his rifle, checking the load. Donna Rosa, calm as a river stone, bolted the heavy wooden door and shuttered the windows. The cozy room instantly became a dark, claustrophobic box. Flora's breath came in ragged gasps. Trapped. The word echoed in her mind, a terrifying refrain. She was back on the platform, back in the raiders' camp, caged and helpless. They won't get in, Donna Rosa said, her voice steady. This house is stone, built to stand. But they could wait. They could starve them out, or they could burn them out. A voice called from the darkness, rough and familiar. It was one of the bounty hunters from the canyon. Caldwell sends his regards, Apache. He wants the girl, and he wants that key you took off my partner. Give them up, and we might let you live. A lie. They all knew it was a lie. Jed moved to a small, concealed loophole in the stone wall, a firing slit his father had built years ago. He peered out. 4 of them, he whispered, maybe more in the rocks. Flora felt a surge of despair. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But then she looked at Jed. His face was calm, focused. He wasn't panicking. He was preparing. He turned to her. You know how to load one of these? He asked, nodding to a second rifle propped against the wall. Flora shook her head, her hands trembling. Then you're about to learn. The first shot splintered the wooden shutter, sending a spray of wood into the room. The siege had begun. Jed returned fire, a single deliberate shot that sent one of the men scrambling for cover with a cry of pain. Hours crawled by. The night was filled with the sharp crack of rifle fire, the ping of bullets ricocheting off stone, and the terrifying silence in between. Flora, huddled beside Donna Rosa, learned to load the heavy rifle, her initial fear slowly being burned away by a cold, hard resolve. She was not the same woman who had been caught stealing bread. She had found something to fight for. During a lull in the shooting, Jed turned his attention back to the key, turning it over and over in his hand. A place of memory. His mind was a blank wall of trauma. He could see the fire, hear the shouts, but the details were blurred. Lost. Think, Jedediah, Donna Rosa urged softly. Where did your father take you when he wanted to teach you something important? Where did he tell you the stories of your people? Jed closed his eyes. A memory flickered. Not of the raid, but of a time before. He was a boy sitting with his father on a high ledge overlooking the basin. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery colors. His father was pointing, not at the mountains or the stars, but at the ground below, at the shadow of the mesa itself. The land remembers, his father had said. It keeps our stories. You just have to know how to read them. The shadow. As the sun set, the long shadow of Thunder Mesa would stretch across the basin, its tip touching one specific lone cottonwood tree, a place his father called the Story Keeper. Jed's eyes snapped open. I know, he breathed. I know where it is. But it was miles away, across open ground, with Caldwell's men surrounding them. Getting to it was impossible. Just then, a new sound reached them. Not gunfire. A low, rumbling groan. The ground beneath them seemed to shift. A tremor. The oil lamp on the table flickered wildly. Donna Rosa crossed herself. Madre de Dios, she whispered. An earthquake. It was small, just a shudder that lasted a few seconds, but it was enough. Outside, there were shouts of alarm, the sound of falling rock from the cliffs above. The tremor had unnerved their attackers, created a moment of chaos. It was the only chance they were going to get. Jed looked at Flora. There's a root cellar, he said, pointing to a heavy trapdoor in the floor. It leads to a tunnel. It comes out in the arroyo, 100 yards from here. My father dug it in case the army ever came. A way out, a sliver of hope in the darkness. You and Donna Rosa go, he said. Get as far away as you can. Flora shook her head, her jaw set. No, you're not staying here to die. I'm not planning to die, he said. I'm going to lead them away from the tunnel. Give you time. He was going to sacrifice himself. She saw it in his eyes. No, Flora said again, her voice fierce. You said we face storms together. This is a storm, Jed. We go together, or we don't go at all. Before he could argue, Donna Rosa spoke. The girl is right. Two broken trees lean together. It is the only way you will both stand. Jed looked at their determined faces, and for the first time, he let someone else share his burden. He nodded once. A plan formed, desperate and dangerous. He would go first, create a diversion. Flora and Donna Rosa would slip out through the tunnel moments later. They would all meet at the Story Keeper, the lone cottonwood tree, if they survived. He unbolted the front door. Be ready, he whispered. He took a deep breath, kicked the door open, and fired two quick shots into the darkness before disappearing around the side of the house. Immediately, gunfire erupted, all of it focused on the area where he'd vanished. It was the diversion they needed. Now, Donna Rosa said, pulling open the heavy trapdoor. A wave of cool, earthy air washed over them. Flora scrambled down the ladder into the darkness, her rifle clutched tight. Donna Rosa followed, pulling the door shut above them, plunging them into absolute blackness. They were in the belly of the earth, the sound of the gun battle above them, muffled and distant. They were free from the house, but they had just stepped into an even bigger trap. The unforgiving desert night, with killers on their heels. The tunnel was tight and smelled of damp earth. Flora navigated by touch, one hand on the rough wall, the other holding the heavy rifle. Behind her, Donna Rosa moved with a steady, unhurried pace. The muffled sounds of the gunfight above faded as they moved deeper underground. When they finally pushed open the exit, concealed behind a thicket of mesquite in a dry arroyo, the night air was cold and sharp. The shooting had stopped. A terrible, profound silence had fallen over the ranch. Flora's heart seized with fear. What did it mean? Was Jed? No, she couldn't think it. He will be there, Donna Rosa said, as if reading her mind. He knows the land. Now we must hurry. They moved through the shadows, two ghosts slipping through the sagebrush. Every rock looked like a crouching man. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing footstep. The moon was a sliver, offering little light and even less comfort. The lone cottonwood tree was a dark silhouette on a low rise, miles away. It seemed an impossible distance. They had been running for what felt like an hour when they saw a flicker of movement on the ridge to their left. A man on a horse, backlit by the rising moon. One of Caldwell's men. He hadn't fallen for Jed's diversion. He was circling, hunting. They dropped to the ground, pressing themselves into the sparse cover. The rider stopped, scanning the basin below. Flora held her breath, praying he wouldn't see them. He was too far away for a clean shot, and the flash of the rifle would give away their position to everyone. They were pinned down. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then from the opposite direction came that low, sharp whistle, the signal Jed had used in the canyon. The rider on the ridge tensed, turning toward the sound. The whistle came again, closer this time, drawing the man's attention. It was Jed. He was alive, and he was pulling the hunter away from them, just as he'd drawn the others away from the house. The rider spurred his horse, galloping off toward the sound. Go! Donna Rosa urged, and they were running again, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They finally reached the cottonwood tree, collapsing at its base, gasping for air. The tree stood alone, its roots gripping the dry earth, a silent witness to generations of history. Flora looked around frantically. There was no sign of Jed. Had the hunter caught him? Had she led them here only to lose him? Donna Rosa placed a calming hand on her arm. Patience, Nina. He will come. She pointed toward the base of the tree. The earth was disturbed. A large, flat stone had been set into the ground, a stone that didn't quite match the others around it. This was it. Together they pried at the heavy stone, their fingers raw and bleeding, until it finally shifted. Beneath it was a cavity, and inside that, a small metal box, rusted with age. Flora's hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was heavy, but it was locked. They had the box, but without Jed and the key, it was useless. As if summoned by their thoughts, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Jed. He was limping, a dark stain spreading on his pant leg, but he was alive. He leaned against the tree, his face pale in the moonlight. He won't be following us anymore, he said, his voice strained. He held out the iron key. Flora took it, her fingers brushing his. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. She lifted the lid. Inside, bundled in oilcloth, were the papers. Deeds to land stolen by Caldwell. Witness statements, signed and dated, detailing his crimes, including the raid on Jed's family. There was even a signed confession from one of his own men, a man who had clearly grown a conscience before meeting an untimely end. It was all there, enough to hang Caldwell 10 times over. They had the proof. But they were still miles from any town, injured, exhausted, and hunted. The proof was worthless if they died in the desert, and just as that grim thought settled in, they heard it. Hoofbeats, not one rider, but many, coming fast. They weren't from the direction of the ranch. They were coming from the east, from the direction of the town. Caldwell. He must have realized his men had failed and was coming to finish the job himself. There was nowhere left to run. This was the end of the line. Jed pushed himself off the tree, leveling his rifle, preparing to make a last stand. Flora stood beside him, reloading her own weapon. They would face this storm together. But the riders who burst over the rise weren't Caldwell's thugs. They were uniformed men, territorial marshals, their badges glinting in the moonlight. At their lead was a man Flora recognized, the circuit judge who sometimes visited Esperanza Wells. And riding beside him, guiding them, was the bound bounty hunter they had left in the canyon. He must have worked himself free and gone straight to the law, hoping for leniency. Standing on the rise, watching it all unfold, was a lone figure, Caldwell. He had seen the marshals and realized the game was up. His face was a mask of pure fury. He raised his own rifle, not at the marshals, but at Jed and Flora. If he was going down, he was taking them with him. A single shot rang out, but it wasn't from Caldwell's rifle. It was from Donna Rosa's. She stood beside the tree, an old pistol in her hand, smoke curling from the barrel. Caldwell staggered, clutching his shoulder, his rifle falling to the ground. The marshals swarmed him, taking him into custody. It was over. The circuit judge dismounted, walking toward them. He looked at the box, at the papers Flora held out to him. He read them by the light of a lantern, his expression growing grimmer with every page. "We've been building a case against Caldwell for years," he said, his voice weary, "but we never had proof like this. You've done this territory a great service." He looked at Jed's leg, at the exhaustion etched on their faces. "Let's get you folks taken care of." Days later, winter edged slowly into the basin. Frost silvered the sage at dawn. Jed's leg was healing, and the ranch house, pockmarked with bullet holes, felt more like a home than ever. Caldwell and his men were gone. Their reign of terror ended. The town of Esperanza Wells was breathing freely for the first time in years. The stolen lands were being returned to their rightful owners, thanks to the papers in the box. One evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of crimson, Jed and Flora stood on the ridge overlooking their small valley. The land stretched before them, vast and beautiful. Flora slipped her hand into his. "I used to think freedom meant never staying in one place," she whispered, "but I was wrong. Freedom is choosing where your soul can rest." Jed squeezed her hand, his touch steady as the mountain beside them. "And you've chosen here." She looked at him, her eyes clear and full of a love forged in fire and fear. "I've chosen us." The wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of sage and new beginnings. Below them, the small stone house stood, a testament to their survival. A sanctuary. They were no longer two broken trees leaning on each other. They were rooted, strong, and standing together. A home at last. If you enjoyed Jed and Flora's journey and believe that justice will always find a way, hit that like button to let me know. And don't forget to subscribe because there are always more stories in the shadows waiting to be told.